Today's video is going to be a simple one. I just got back from vacation in Puerto Rico, so I don't have time to do a lot of editing. If you're new to the channel, my name's Austin. I'm building Generate, a text-to-object generator. I'm going to talk about the technology that I'm learning this year. Maybe you're an architect and curious about some potential software that you should be learning, or maybe you're a software engineer and you want to compare tech stacks. I'm going to cover what I've already learned, what I'm learning this year, and then where my learning is heading. So last year, the first technology that I learned was DaVinci Resolve. That's the editor I use to make these videos for YouTube. In 2022, I was using Premiere Pro, and in 2023, I switched to DaVinci Resolve, and I love it. It is better with color grading and just the layout of things and the snappiness, and it feels like it was made more thoughtfully, whereas Premiere Pro feels like an older program. The next technology I learned in 2023 was Python. I already had some experience with it, but I continued to grow that expertise. Along with Python, I dabbled with PyTorch, the framework for Python that allows you to do machine learning. I did some projects with PostgreSQL, and I did some MySQL too, but PostgreSQL is what I landed on for the finished project. And then I used the Django as backend framework, and I learned some more terminal stuff, so like Bash and ZSH, and universal scene description is a file type that I am interested in, and so I messed around with that a little bit. I'm looking forward to learning more about universal scene description. And then 3JS. So in 2023, I was into web dev, and 3JS is a framework for manipulating 3D models on the web. So along with that web dev idea, I had Next.js, which is another web framework, and then TypeScript and React. So React is just a framework to automate and speed up a lot of things that you would build for a website in TypeScript or JavaScript without having to build them from scratch. The first technology I'm learning this year is Unreal Engine. Back in architecture school, I used Unreal Engine to make stills of 3D environments, but my use case now has changed from then. Now I'm building a object generator and eventually a text to 3D model generator. And as a part of that, in 2023, when I was focused on web dev, I thought that I would build it all myself. But in 2024, I decided to focus more on the machine learning aspect and allow a video game engine to handle the graphics. Not to mention that I'm going to need to learn more of Unreal Engine anyway if I want to ship to VR. And I think my customers would prefer Unreal Engine because it has the highest capability for photorealism, which building developers and designers and construction people appreciate that attribute. Not to mention all of the other things that are great with Unreal Engine, like I prefer C++ to C#, so that already makes me lean towards Unreal Engine as opposed to something like Unity. The documentation is better than something like Omniverse, and it's more built out. You get things like Nanite and Lumen. So there are a lot of benefits here, and this is Unreal Engine is the graphics engine of the text to 3D model generator that I'm building. So the next technology I'm learning is DaVinci Resolve. So even though I can use DaVinci Resolve to make these amateur videos and I can balance audio, and I can get lighting and edit transitions. There is so much depth to DaVinci Resolve where people make cinematography and incredible VFX with it. And with every video that I make, I'm trying to increase the quality, to increase the enjoyability for my audience, and have it be more digestible and more enjoyable. And that just requires more editing capability than I currently have. So I'm going to continue to study and improve when it comes to video editing. Moving on, C++ is how Unreal Engine is written. So C++ is actually my first language I ever learned, and it's very verbose, and because of that, it's easier to write bugs. You can also get things like memory leaks because you're dealing with pointers and memory management. So it's a harder language to write in, but the trade-off is that you get a quicker language, which comes in handy when you're doing graphics, because graphics are really processing intensive. Even with 4090 GPUs, we still struggle with doing graphics. Although in a lot of games now you can get like 250, 300 FPS. So we're overcoming that limitation. So I love C++. The reason I left C++ in, what was it, 2019, 2020, was that I wanted a easier language to program in and a faster programming language in terms of development turnaround, not in terms of compilation. So that's how I got to Python. Now I've come back to C++ because if I want to change things in Unreal Engine at a lower level or develop features for the engine, then I will want to probably do that in C++. Not to mention that if I come to some limitation with Python and needs performance improvements, there are things you can do in Python to speed up, but one of the things you can do is writing your code in C++. So Python. I've already done a couple projects in Python. Python's great. It's my preferred programming language at the moment. So I'm going to keep learning Python, and then I'm going to keep learning PyTorch as well. PostgreSQL, even though I have a database right now, I don't feel like I'm that strong in SQL and doing queries. So that's something that I can definitely develop. As you can imagine, when I'm juggling all of these different technologies trying to build a company, there's not enough time in a day to become an expert at all of them. So SQL is one of the ones where I've only learned enough to get by. So even though I would like to learn about everything in every program, that's just not feasible. This is where growing the team is going to come in handy, because then I can reduce the areas of expertise that I'm responsible for. And then Django again. So a lot of the backend frameworks and backend stuff is going to continue to develop it. It's essential to the program. A new one for this year is Docker. I noticed when I was using AWS that they were using Docker for the build step of my full stack website. And I was interested in Docker before that, and I've heard that you can use it to deploy anywhere, so that sounds great. More deployability is a good thing. Not the highest priority, but I do want to get into that eventually. Next is Azure DevOps. So currently I use GitHub Actions for continuous integration, continuous deployment, and I use Notion for tracking projects. And I've seen things like Asana and like Trello and that these programs that have Kanban boards, and I think Azure DevOps has that. So I'm interested in looking into that, because if I could get two of my apps and turn them into one, that would simplify the tech stack, and I'd appreciate that. Not to mention that Azure DevOps would be integrated into where I host my programs to begin with. And then continuing my expertise in Bash and ZSH. And so I put the terminal icon, but this is like a catch-all for Bash, ZSH, PowerShell, and Windows Subsystem Linux. That's a newer one that I don't have a lot of understanding of. I have understanding of Linux, but I don't really get how they got Linux inside of Windows. So I would need to do some research into understanding that. And then, like I said, PowerShell, I'm not as comfortable with as Bash or ZSH. So that's one that I would want to practice with. And then I need to dive into the universal scene description file. I need to have like memorized what the structure of that is, because these are going to be the key files that I'm manipulating to generate objects. This is like, if you do any kind of CAD, this is like your .obj file or your .fbx file. This is the newer version of those that is more interchangeable. So they're not, I've looked a little bit into them. They're not as simple as a OBJ file. So manipulating them will be, just requires understanding the structure. Second to last is cron jobs. So a cron job is like a scheduled task, and I just think that'd be really useful. And last but not least is JetBrains. So I've been using the Writer IDE to replace Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio for the past month, and I've been liking it a lot. The interface is simplified and it feels snappy. It's also cross-platform, so because I use Linux and Windows, I can stay on the same IDE, as opposed to if I use Visual Studio, that only works on Windows, and then when I switch to Linux, I have to use Visual Studio Code, and I just don't like switching. Oh, I should talk about the other ones. So JetBrains has a bunch of different IDEs, even though you could use different languages within for any one in particular, Writer, for example. But for my use case, the one that I'm also interested in is PyCharm. I hear people like it a lot for Python development, so I'm going to be looking into that as well. So I think the overall theme for this year has just been a shift away from web development and a shift towards VR. There. That's everything I'm studying in 2024. Now, let's look into the future just to understand where this is all going. So, the first thing I have for 2025 and beyond is ChatGPT, but this is really just lumped together with these two other ones, which are like LLMs, generative images, and all of this is really just like text models and generative AI and machine learning. I want to get deeper into that world, and that's going to mean more PyTorch and maybe some TensorFlow, maybe some Keras or scikit-learn. I will see what the future brings. Next is MetaQuest, and there's big changes being made right now. Apparently, I read a story that Meta is switching their strategy and to stop doing the full stack of the VR headset and allow third parties to take responsibility for the hardware while Meta focuses on the operating system. I actually love this decision. I think that what's holding VR back is the software, not the hardware. And this decision by Meta to focus on the software is perfect. If they could be the Windows of the virtual reality wave, and then all the other manufacturers like Asus and MSI continue to be what they were for the desktop and laptop, then that would be perfect. So anyway, what does this mean for my software development? Well, Meta is developing their Quest operating system. Right now it's very much like a video game or like a mobile, like iPad kind of operating system where you're very limited in what you can do with it. But I could see and hope that it's developed into something more like Windows or Linux or Mac OS, where it's more general purpose. You have access to files and can manipulate them in any way you want and use your hardware at a lower level. And if that's the case, then I need to learn that operating system, no different than how I need to learn Linux and Windows. And lastly are these three, which are like the potential languages. So these are languages that have been built more recently and they're younger in their development cycle, so they may lack some things like type checking or some linting or libraries or all the stuff that goes into developing with a language. However, they're made by genius people and they were made to solve some of the problems that the previous, current programming languages have. So, for example, I'm going to leave verse till the end because that one's more Unreal specific, but Swift. Swift was made by Chris Latner in Apple, and the idea that someone could go to Apple who is using C and convince them all to switch to a language, but not only a language, but a language that he wrote, is insane. And I trust the people at Apple to be smarter than me. So that's all the evidence I need. My problem with Swift is that it's mostly for Mac OS and iOS development. So that's not my world. I don't like that they're a closed ecosystem, even though I have an iPhone. So Swift is interesting, and mostly I'm interested in it just because the syntax is really nice. And I like Apple's ARKit, but I don't see myself using this in the near term. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting when we talk about the next language, Mojo, because the same guy that made Swift left Apple to create his next language that he said fixed things that Swift got wrong. So this is like fixing the fix. And this is also a language that is written very similarly to Python. And it's supposed to be a superset of Python. So it just adds features, I guess, to Python. And it's supposed to be way quicker than Python. So imagine like the ease of development of Python, but with the speed of C++. That's what I get from this. And I hear that he had to I think I heard that he had to write like a new compiler, and I'm not gonna even get into that. So anyway, very exciting, but it's very young. So for example, this programming language, Mojo, doesn't even have classes. So you can imagine like all the things it lacks. But if it does catch on, which it could for all of these benefits, it's program I'm very open to learning. And then the last one is Verse, which is Tim Sweeney's baby. He has talked about making a programming language to be specific to Unreal Engine development and make their development process a lot quicker. I honestly don't know a lot about this language. I've watched a video, but I don't remember a lot of what I watched. But given that I'm doing Unreal Engine development and this is a language built for that engine, that seems interesting to me.